The papers hit Bessie Rhodes's hands before she could draw a single breath to prepare herself. Graham Mercer stood before her in the dying afternoon light of Redemption Creek, his weathered face carved with lines that told of 1,000 hard miles and 100 harder choices. Dust clung to his coat, blood dried brown at his collar, and his gray eyes carried something she had not expected from a man with a price on his head: guilt. Raw, unvarnished guilt that he could not hide behind the brim of his hat or the shadow of his reputation. "These were taken from your father before he passed," he said, and his voice broke on the last word in a way that a man like Graham Mercer was not supposed to break. Bessie's fingers trembled against the folded pages. The leather cord that had once bound them was frayed and knotted in a way she recognized, because her father, Thomas Rhodes, had tied every important document in exactly the same sailor's knot he had learned from a fisherman in Galveston before the war. Her breath left her body in one silent rush. "Where did you get these?" she whispered. Graham did not answer immediately. He pulled his hat from his head and turned it in his hands, looking at the brim rather than at her, and that single gesture of shame told her more than any confession could. "I was there," he said. "The night your father died on the Calabasas Road. I was there, and I did not stop what happened. That is the truth I have been carrying, Miss Rhodes, and I cannot carry it one step further." The world around Bessie seemed to tilt. The sound of the creek, the distant laugh of a mule out behind the livery, the smell of wood smoke drifting from the cookhouse, all of it fell away into a ringing silence. Her fingers tightened on the papers until her knuckles went white. She had spent 8 months in this hard little town looking for answers. 8 months riding from courthouse to sheriff's office to land registry, trying to understand why her father's homestead claim had been erased from every legal record, as though Thomas Rhodes had never drawn breath or driven a single fence post into New Mexico soil. 8 months of doors closing in her face and men looking past her, as though a woman asking questions was an inconvenience rather than a human being with a right to the truth. And now the truth was standing in front of her with dried blood on his collar and borrowed spurs on his boots, and she did not know whether to weep or to reach for the small pistol tucked against her hip. She chose neither. She opened the papers instead. Her father's handwriting swam before her eyes: the homestead deed, the water rights filing, the letter he had written to the land commissioner in Santa Fe, dated September 14, 1882, 3 weeks before his death. Her throat closed completely when she saw the second document, the one written in a different hand, the one that named the men who had conspired to strip Thomas Rhodes of everything he had legally claimed and rightfully owned in the territory of New Mexico. The name at the top of that list was Clifton Hale. Clifton Hale, who owned half of Lincoln County. Clifton Hale, who had offered to buy her father's land twice and been refused twice. Clifton Hale, whose men rode with silver conchos on their bridles and rifles across their saddles, and an absolute certainty that the law in this territory answered to the man who owned it. Bessie raised her eyes to Graham Mercer's face. "You rode for Clifton Hale," she said. "It was not a question." "I did," he answered, "until I did not." He met her gaze then, and she saw that the guilt in his gray eyes was layered over something else, something older and harder, a kind of damage that did not come from a single night on a dark road, but from years of choices made in the wrong direction for reasons that had seemed, at the time, survivable. This was not the beginning of their story, though it was the moment that changed everything. Their story had begun 6 weeks earlier, in the road dust outside the Redemption Creek post office, when Bessie Rhodes had stepped down from the stage and put her boot straight through a rotted board on the walkway and nearly gone down face first into the street, and a lean, sun-darkened man in a gray coat had caught her elbow before she hit the ground. She had pulled her arm back immediately. "I can manage," she had said, which was exactly the kind of thing she always said. "No doubt," he had replied and stepped back, and that was all. She had not known his name then. She had been focused entirely on the envelope in her satchel, the letter from her father's neighbor, old Consuela Vega, who had written to Bessie in Kansas City to say that something was very wrong, that the men in long coats had come and put papers on the door of Thomas Rhodes's house, and that Thomas himself had not been seen in 11 days. Bessie had arrived to find her father already buried in the rocky soil of the churchyard, a crude cross marking a grave that the undertaker, a nervous little man named Peavy, could not quite meet her eyes while describing. The official story was a riding accident, a spooked horse on a dark road, a broken neck. It happened all the time in the territory, people told her, as though frequency made tragedy acceptable. She had not believed it for a single moment. Thomas Rhodes had been riding horses since before Bessie was born. He had ridden through blizzards and floods and Apache country and every kind of terrain that New Mexico could offer, and he had never once been unseated. Her father had been murdered, and she intended to prove it, and she was willing to remain in Redemption Creek for as long as it took. The problem was money. She had arrived with $42 and the deed to a homestead that no longer appeared in the county records. She needed work, and she needed it quickly, and the only position available in Redemption Creek for a woman of her qualifications. She could read, write, perform arithmetic with precision, and had spent 2 years as a legal secretary in Kansas City before her employer's practice had failed. Was a position as bookkeeper for the Redemption Creek Mercantile, owned by a stout, good-natured man named Felix Drummond, who was drowning in receipts and invoices, and had not balanced his ledgers in 18 months. She had taken the job the same afternoon she arrived. It was in her 3rd week of employment at the Mercantile that she had properly encountered Graham Mercer for the 2nd time. He had come in for ammunition and a length of rope, setting $2 silver on the counter with the economical movements of a man who did not waste anything, not money, not words, not motion. He had looked up when Bessie came through the back storeroom door with a ledger under her arm, and he had recognized her from the stage stop. She could see it in the brief tightening around his eyes. "You stayed," he observed. "I have business here," she said. Felix Drummond introduced them with the cheerful obliviousness of a man who did not read undercurrents. Graham Mercer, he explained, was a hand out at the Hale spread, one of the steady ones, been around Lincoln County a few years now, very reliable. Graham Mercer nodded at the introduction with his hat in his hands and said nothing that was not necessary. Bessie noted the name of his employer and filed it carefully. She did not seek him out after that. But Redemption Creek was not a large town, barely 500 souls clinging to the edge of a creek that ran dry every August, and encounters were inevitable. She saw him at the post office. She saw him outside the livery. She saw him 3 times at the counter of the Mercantile, always buying practical things, always paying in exact coin, always leaving without lingering. What she noticed, because she was a woman who paid attention to details, was that Graham Mercer always looked tired, but not in the way of a man who worked hard. He looked tired in the way of a man who carried something heavy that had nothing to do with physical weight. She noticed something else, too. When the Hale riders came into town in groups, loud and careless, riding down the middle of Main Street with their silver conchos flashing, Graham Mercer was never among them. He came alone. He went quietly. He did not participate in their cruelty, and the Hale riders were cruel in the casual, thoughtless way of men who had learned that no one would stop them riding too close to pedestrians on purpose, letting their horses trample kitchen gardens, leaving their bills unpaid at establishments that could not afford to refuse them. She began to wonder about Graham Mercer. She told herself it was strategic curiosity, nothing more. She needed to know everything about the Hale operation if she was going to find a way to expose what had happened to her father, and Graham Mercer was a thread she had not yet pulled. She was not interested in him as a man. She was not interested in any man at present. She had work to do. This self-deception lasted approximately 2 more weeks, until the evening she was working late at the Mercantile, adding a long column of figures by lamplight, and heard the sound of boots on the boardwalk outside, and then a heavy thump against the wall that was not consistent with a man simply leaning on it. She went to the door and opened it. Graham Mercer was sitting on the boardwalk with his back against the wall and his legs stretched out in front of him, holding one hand clamped over his left side. In the lamplight from the door, she could see the dark stain spreading between his fingers. "Go inside," he said immediately. "It is nothing." "It is clearly not nothing," Bessie said, with the flat practicality that her mother had always called her finest quality, and her suitors had always called her most frustrating one. "Come inside before you bleed on Felix Drummond's clean boards and he charges you for it." He had looked up at her then with an expression she could not immediately name, something between wariness and a kind of desperate relief, and he had come inside. The wound was a graze. A bullet had cut a furrow along his left side, missing his ribs by perhaps an inch. It had bled heavily but was not life-threatening. Bessie had cleaned and bound it with the practical efficiency of a woman who had grown up on a homestead far from town doctors, and had learned that squeamishness was a luxury the frontier did not offer. He sat very still throughout the process and said nothing, which she respected. When she finished, she washed her hands and poured him 2 fingers of the whiskey Felix kept under the counter for customers who arrived looking like they needed it before they could conduct business. "Who shot you?" she asked. "A man whose name does not matter," Graham said. "It matters if he is going to try again." Something shifted in his expression. "He will not try again. He made his point." "What was the point?" He looked at her steadily. "That I should not ask questions about things that are not my business." Bessie sat down across from him and looked at him for a long moment. The lamp burned between them. Outside, Redemption Creek was settling into its nighttime quiet, horses shifting in the livery, the distant sound of someone's piano at the saloon 3 streets over. "What did you ask questions about?" she said. "Miss Rhodes," he said carefully, "there are things happening in this county that are dangerous for anyone who looks at them too closely. You came here for a reason. I know what that reason is. I am asking you to be careful." She felt the back of her neck prickle. "You know why I am here. Your father homesteaded the western acreage above Seco Creek. The claim was filed legally in 1879 and recorded at the Lincoln County Courthouse. The record disappeared from the courthouse in October of last year, 2 weeks after your father died." He said it quietly, without drama, watching her face. "I know because I was asked to help make it disappear, and I refused, and that is when things became complicated." The silence between them was absolute. "You refused," Bessie said at last. "I did." "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because a man earned that land with honest work, because erasing his record was wrong. Because," he stopped and looked down at the glass of whiskey, "because I have spent a considerable number of years doing things that were wrong, and I am trying to stop." Bessie Rhodes had spent 8 months in a state of concentrated, purposeful fury, the kind of fury that kept a person moving and functioning and asking questions when grief would otherwise be paralyzing. In that moment, looking at this weathered, wounded man who had refused to erase her father's record and been shot for it, she felt the fury bank down slightly and something more complicated take its place. "Tell me everything you know," she said. He did. It took most of the night. He told her about Clifton Hale, who had built his empire in Lincoln County across 15 years through a combination of legitimate cattle operations and a ruthless willingness to acquire land through any means available: pressure, forgery, violence when necessary. He told her about the men Hale kept on his payroll who were not ranch hands in any real sense, but enforcers, collectors, men who made problems go away. He told her that he himself had come to Hale's employment 3 years earlier, after a period of his life he described with bare, undecorated honesty as entirely disreputable, and that he had been trying for 2 years to find a way out that did not involve a bullet. He told her that Thomas Rhodes's refusal to sell had been the final escalation, that Hale had decided to simply take the land, that he had arranged for Thomas Rhodes to be intercepted on the Calabasas Road, that the papers proving Thomas Rhodes's claim had been seized, and that Thomas Rhodes himself had been killed, and the death made to look like an accident. He told her he had known about the plan in advance and had not been able to stop it, and that this was something he would carry for the rest of his life. Bessie listened to all of it without speaking. When he finished, she asked him one question. "Do you know where the papers are now?" "Yes," he said. "Clifton Hale keeps them in the iron safe in his study at the ranch house, along with every other document he has stolen or forged over 15 years. "Then I need those papers," Bessie said. Graham Mercer looked at her as though she had suggested they fly to Santa Fe on the backs of eagles. "Miss Rhodes," he said, "Clifton Hale has 14 armed men on that ranch. I am aware that recovering the documents will require some planning," she said, with a calmness she did not entirely feel. "But those papers are my father's legal record and my legal inheritance, and Clifton Hale stole them from a dying man, and I intend to have them back." He stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him making calculations she was not privy to, weighing risks she could only partially understand. "If I help you," he said finally, "I need you to understand what that means. It means I am done with Hale entirely, and there is no position in this territory safe enough for a man who has crossed Clifton Hale and lived to tell about it." "Then you should have left already," Bessie said. "What has kept you?" The question landed somewhere it was not entirely designed to go. She could see it in the way he looked at her, the way the careful, controlled surface of him shifted for just a moment before he drew it back. "Nothing that made enough sense to say out loud," he answered. She let that go. She was practical enough to recognize that this was not the moment for that conversation, whatever it was. They began to plan. Over the following week, Bessie went about her work at the mercantile with perfect outward normality, while underneath she was doing something else entirely. Graham Mercer came in twice with minor purchases, and managed to convey, in the space of brief, seemingly unremarkable exchanges, enough information for her to understand that he had identified when Clifton Hale would be absent from the main ranch house. A meeting with his cattle buyers in Lincoln on a Saturday, expected to last the full day, and that he had located a key to the study's back window that was kept by a housekeeper who owed Graham a favor she would be willing to discharge in this way. Not knowing the full nature of what the favor entailed, Bessie did not tell anyone else. She trusted Felix Drummond's goodness but not his discretion. He was a man who talked freely, without malice, and she could not afford that. She wrote a letter to a lawyer in Santa Fe, a man named Everett Cole who had been recommended to her by Consuela Vega's son, and she described in careful, coded language what she was hoping to obtain and what she intended to do with it once she had it. She sent the letter and prayed. The Saturday arrived with the kind of brilliant, indifferent sky that New Mexico delivered in early November of 1882. A blue so deep and clear it seemed almost to mock the anxious human concerns occurring beneath it. Bessie met Graham at the creek crossing 2 miles south of town at 7 in the morning. She had ridden the horse Felix Drummond had lent her without asking what she needed it for, another quality she appreciated about Felix, and she was wearing her father's heavy canvas coat because the morning was cold and the coat made her feel, in a way she could not fully explain, as though her father was riding alongside her. Graham was already at the crossing. He looked like he had not slept. "You should go back," he said by way of greeting. "Good morning," Bessie replied. "I am not going back, shall we?" He shook his head slowly, but there was something in the motion that was not quite disapproval. They rode. The Hale Ranch was 7 miles northwest of Redemption Creek, set in a wide valley where the grass had been good once and was now grazed down to nubs by too many cattle on too much of the same land. The main house was a large adobe structure with a red tile roof, prosperous-looking and grim at the same time, surrounded by outbuildings, a large barn, corrals, and a bunkhouse where 8 or 10 men would be at any given time. Hale himself had ridden out before dawn with his foreman and 2 other men. Graham had confirmed this through channels he did not specify. They approached from the east along a dry wash that kept them below the sightline of the corrals. Graham knew the ranch's rhythms with the intimacy of a man who had lived within them for 3 years, and he led them to a back gate near the kitchen garden that opened on a hinge that had been oiled recently and made no sound. The study's back window was unlatched, as promised. Bessie went through first because Graham's shoulders barely fitted the frame, and because she was smaller and quicker, and because she wanted to be the one who opened the safe. She needed to be the one who opened it. It was important to her in a way she could not justify logically but felt completely. The study smelled of leather and tobacco, and the particular dry, papery smell of documents stored in quantity. The iron safe sat against the north wall, squat and dark, with a combination lock that Graham had obtained, at considerable personal risk, by memorizing the sequence over 3 occasions when he had been in the room while Hale opened it. Her hands were shaking slightly. She would not have admitted this to anyone. She worked the combination. The tumblers fell with small, precise clicks that sounded enormous in the silence of the room. The heavy door swung open. Inside were documents stacked in careful order, more documents than she had expected. She found her father's homestead deed in the 3rd stack, the leather cord, tied in her father's sailor's knot. She pressed the bundle against her chest for one breathless moment with her eyes closed, and in that moment she felt the grief she had been outrunning for 8 months catch up with her entirely and strike her somewhere deep and irreparable. She did not cry. She straightened. She took the full stack of documents because Graham had told her that every one of them represented someone wronged, and because a lawyer in Santa Fe was going to need evidence. They were back at the window in under 12 minutes. They nearly made it clean. One of Hale's men, a heavy-set fellow named Birch who had stayed behind with a sore foot, was crossing from the bunkhouse to the privy and had the misfortune of looking up at exactly the wrong moment. He saw Graham coming through the window and shouted, and then everything happened very fast. Graham grabbed Bessie's hand and they ran for the east gate, and Birch was shouting, and another man came out of the barn, and there were 3 shots fired in total, 2 by Hale's men, wide and high, and 1 by Graham, aimed deliberately at the ground between Birch's feet to buy them 6 seconds of hesitation, which was exactly what they needed to reach their horses. They rode hard for 4 miles before Graham signaled her to pull off the main road and take the high trail along the ridge, which added time but removed them from the most obvious pursuit route. He knew this country better than she did, and she followed his lead without argument, which was not easy for her but was the right tactical decision, and she knew it. They did not stop until they reached an old line shack Graham knew, 2 hours east of the main road, a weathered structure barely big enough to shelter 2 horses under its leaning extension, with a pot-bellied iron stove that still worked, and a supply of dry wood left by whoever had used it last. Bessie sat on an overturned crate and held the documents against her chest, and finally, with the door closed and Graham Mercer standing watch at the single small window, she cried. Not loudly. She was not a loud crier, but the tears came and would not be stopped, and she let them come because they had been waiting long enough and the time for running from them had passed. Graham did not say anything for a while. He stood at the window with his back to her and gave her privacy, and she would remember that later as one of the most considerate things anyone had ever done for her. When the storm passed, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, in a voice that was slightly unsteady but functional, "Thank you." He turned from the window. In the dim light of the shack, his face was difficult to read, but she was getting better at reading it. "Are you all right?" he asked. "No," she said honestly, "but I will be." He built a fire in the pot-bellied stove without being asked, with the efficient economy of motion that characterized everything he did, and the little shack warmed around them and the light grew amber and close. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall opposite her, his long legs stretched out, his hat on the floor beside him. Bessie went through the documents methodically. She had brought a small journal and a pencil, and she made notes in her careful secretary's hand, names, dates, amounts, descriptions. It took her 2 hours. Graham did not rush her. He watched the window and occasionally checked outside and said very little. What she found was worse than she had expected and exactly as bad as she had feared. Clifton Hale had been stealing land for 15 years. The documents in that safe represented 12 separate families displaced from homesteads they had legally filed, their records erased, their protests ignored. 3 of those families had men who had died in circumstances similar to her father's. 3 separate murders dressed as accidents. When she looked up from her notes, she found Graham watching her face. 12 families, she said. I know, he said. You knew about this, about all of it. Not all of it, not from the beginning. I knew some, I suspected more. He met her eyes steadily. There is no version of this where I am a good person, Miss Rhodes. I am not asking you to believe otherwise. I am asking you to let me help make it right, which is not the same thing. Bessie regarded him for a long moment. She thought about the nature of complicity. She thought about the difference between the men who had pulled triggers and the men who had looked away. She thought about her father, who had believed in the possibility of redemption for people who genuinely sought it, who had quoted scripture on the subject with more fervor than on almost any other topic. The lawyer in Santa Fe is named Everett Cole, she said. We need to get these documents to him. Something in Graham's face shifted, a release of tension he had been holding perhaps, or the beginning of something new. Santa Fe is a 3-day ride. Then we should start tomorrow morning, Bessie said. Can we stay here tonight? The shack is sound enough. Hale's men will not find this trail before morning. After that, he paused. After that, I think you should know that Clifton Hale will not simply let this go. What we took from that safe is the foundation of everything he has built. If Everett Cole takes those documents to the territorial court, Hale is looking at the end of everything he owns. He will send men after us. Then we will deal with that, Bessie said. It may not be simple. I am not a simple person, she replied, and something like a smile crossed his face, brief, unpracticed, as though smiling was something he had learned once and then gotten out of the habit of. They slept in shifts, which was sensible. Bessie slept first, wrapped in a horse blanket that smelled strongly of horse but was warm enough. And when Graham woke her at what she estimated was 2 in the morning, she was rested enough to take the watch and let him sleep. She sat by the small window with her hand near the pistol on her belt and looked out at the cold New Mexico dark. The stars enormous and indifferent, the land silver and black and very still. And she thought about her father, and about the papers tucked safely inside her coat, and about the man sleeping on the floor behind her with his coat folded under his head. She thought about the way Graham Mercer had looked when he handed her those papers, not in the line shack but later in Redemption Creek, in the moment she had come to think of as the pivot point, the moment the whole story turned. She thought about the guilt in his gray eyes and the way he had said the last word passed as though it cost him something to say it. She thought about what it meant that he had kept those papers. He could have thrown them away. He could have burned them. Keeping them was a choice, and bringing them to her was a choice, and every choice had weight and meaning. Her father had always said that a person's character was not made by their best moments, but by what they did in their worst ones. Graham Mercer had done terrible things. He had also refused to erase her father's record and been shot for it. He had kept the papers and returned them. He had brought her to the safe and helped her retrieve what was rightfully hers. She did not forgive him for what he had been part of, but she began, in the cold and quiet of that night watch, to understand him. And understanding was the beginning of something she was not yet ready to name. They rode out at first light. The journey to Santa Fe in November of 1882 was not a simple undertaking. The Sangre de Cristo Mountains were cold, and the passes were dusted with early snow, and they had to stop twice to wait out whether that was not dangerous enough to be life-threatening, but was unpleasant enough to require shelter. They stayed at a trading post the first night, sharing the common room with 4 other travelers, and at a small cattle ranch the second night, where the rancher's wife fed them beef stew and cornbread and asked no questions about why they were traveling together, which Bessie appreciated. It was during that second evening, sitting by the rancher's fire while the wind pushed at the shutters, and the rancher and his wife had retired early, that the conversation shifted. It began with something simple: Graham asking about her life before she came to Redemption Creek, which was the first personal question he had asked her. She told him about Kansas City, about the legal secretary position, about the small apartment on the third floor of a building on Commerce Street, where she had lived with a degree of independence that most women her age had not managed. She told him she was 26 years old and that she had made her own way since she was 22, when her mother had died and she had left the homestead to make her way in the city, not anticipating that her father would be alone there until the end. The guilt in her voice was audible and she knew it. "You could not have prevented what Hale did," Graham said. "I know that logically," she said. "Logic and grief are not the same country." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "No," he agreed. "They are not." She asked him then because she felt they were in a space where the question could be asked about his own history, where he came from, what the disreputable period of his life had looked like before he came to Lincoln County. He told her. It was not a comfortable story, and he did not try to make it comfortable. He was 33 years old. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a tenant farmer, one of 6 children, chronically poor in the grinding, unrelenting way that left marks on a person's relationship with security and sufficiency. He had left at 17 to find work and had found, instead, a series of escalating bad decisions. First, legitimate ranch work, then driving cattle for outfits that were not particular about the ownership of the cattle, then associating with men whose methods of solving problems involved guns, and then the slow, years-long process of realizing that he had become someone he would not have recognized at 17 and did not particularly want to be. Hale's operation had been, in a terrible way, a step-up steady pay, no outright robbery, just land acquisition by methods that Graham had told himself were only slightly worse than legal. He had known this was a lie from the beginning. He had told it anyway because he needed to eat and because finding a way out of a certain kind of life was harder than getting into it. "The first year," he said, "I told myself it was temporary, that I was just saving enough money to make a clean start somewhere else. Montana, maybe, Wyoming." He paused. "I told myself that for 3 years. "What changed?" Bessie asked. He looked at her steadily. "Your father's land, the order to erase his record." There was something about the specificity of it, a man's whole life's work, reduced to something to be deleted because one powerful man wanted another acre. "I could not do it." He looked back at the fire. "And then your father died and I had the papers and I kept them. I could not explain to myself at the time exactly why, but I kept them." "Because you knew someone should have them," Bessie said. "Even if you did not know who yet." He said nothing. But he met her eyes across the firelight, and in that look she felt something pass between them that neither of them was prepared to address, but that both of them were, very clearly, aware of. They arrived in Santa Fe on the 3rd afternoon, cold and tired and stiff from the saddle, and they went directly to the office of Everett Cole, Esquire, who turned out to be a compact, energetic man of about 50, with a neat gray beard, and the kind of focused attention that made you feel he was giving you his complete and undivided consideration, which he was. He examined the documents with the careful thoroughness of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. He asked precise, pointed questions. He made his own notes in a handwriting much smaller and neater than Bessie's. He was silent for a long stretch when he finished reading, and then he set the documents down and looked at them both. "If these are genuine," he said, "and I believe they are, you have enough here to bring criminal charges against Clifton Hale and at minimum 6 of his associates, including a sitting county judge and a deputy sheriff. You also have grounds for civil recovery of 12 separate land claims." He paused. "What you do not have is protection. Hale will know who brought these to me within a few days if he does not know already, and he will act accordingly." "What do you recommend?" Bessie asked. I need to copy these and send originals to the territorial governor's office in addition to filing with the court. That way there are multiple copies in multiple locations, and suppressing them becomes functionally impossible. He looked at Graham. You, sir, are the material witness. Without your testimony about what you personally observed, some of this becomes difficult to substantiate. Graham said, I will testify. Everett Cole looked at him for a long moment with the assessing gaze of a man who had been lied to by witnesses before and had learned to read the difference. Whatever he saw in Graham Mercer's face appeared to satisfy him. Then we have a case, he said. But I want you both somewhere that is not easily accessible to Hale's people while I file. I have a cousin who owns a boarding house in Albuquerque. I would suggest you go there. I will send word when the filings are complete and the court has issued the relevant orders. They went to Albuquerque. The boarding house was on a quiet street near the old plaza, run by Cole's cousin, a tall, no-nonsense woman named Agatha who asked fewer questions than Felix Drummond's horse and made excellent coffee. Bessie and Graham took separate rooms on the second floor. There was never a question about that, and neither of them introduced one and settled into the strange, suspended quality of waiting that descends on people who have done everything they can do for the moment and must now simply hold still. Holding still was not natural for Bessie Rhodes. She organized her notes into a full written statement for the lawyer. She wrote a long letter to Consuela Vega explaining what had happened and what was in progress. She read every newspaper she could find and tracked what news filtered down from Lincoln County, which was not much and not reassuring. Graham was equally restless in his own contained way. He checked on the horses twice a day. He fixed a broken shutter on Agatha's front window without being asked, and a squeaking step on the back stairs, and the latch on the garden gate that had never closed properly. Agatha, who was not a woman given to excessive praise, told Bessie that her companion was the most useful person who had stayed at the boarding house in 3 years, which was high praise from her. On the fourth evening in Albuquerque, Bessie came down to the common room and found Graham sitting at the table with a book open in front of him that he was not reading. The lamp was lit. Outside, the Albuquerque evening was cool and pleasant, someone's guitar audible from the street, the smell of pinon smoke drifting. She sat down across from him, which was by now a familiar configuration. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "After this, when it is finished?" He closed the book. "I have not thought as far ahead as after." "You should." "I know." He turned the book in his hands. "The testimony will be public record. Any territory that Hale's reach extends to, which is most of New Mexico and parts of Arizona, is going to be difficult. I have considered Montana. The grasslands in the north are still open. There is work for a man who knows cattle, and my history is—" he paused. "Less known up there." "Montana," Bessie said. She tested the word. "That is a long way." "Yes," he said, and looked at her directly. She was quiet for a moment, aware that the conversation had arrived at something they had been approaching for weeks without either of them choosing to acknowledge it directly. "My father's land," she said carefully. "Once the legal claim is restored, if the court restores it, I will have the homestead, the water rights, the house." She looked at the table. "I have been thinking about what I would do with it. I was a legal secretary in Kansas City. I do not know the first thing about running a cattle operation." "Your father knew," Graham said. "It can be learned." "Could it?" She looked up. "By a woman alone." "A woman alone, possibly. A woman with help, certainly." He said it carefully, keeping his voice very neutral, but his gray eyes were doing something they did not usually do. They were asking something, directly and without the usual careful detachment. Bessie felt the warmth of the lamp between them and the sound of the guitar from the street and the solid reality of the boarding house table under her hands, and she thought that she had been alone for a very long time in the sense that mattered, not lonely, because she had always been able to fill herself from within, but alone in the sense of carrying everything herself, every decision, every risk, every consequence. She thought about her father, who had married her mother for love and practical compatibility in roughly equal measure, who had always said the two things were not as different as the poets pretended. "Graham," she said. "Yes," he said, and she could hear in that single syllable that he was not responding to the sound of his name but to something else entirely. "I am not a woman who wants to be managed," she said. "I know," he said. "I have noticed. I am particular about how things are done, and I have strong opinions, and I do not always express them gently." "I have noticed that as well," he said, and there was the brief, unpracticed smile again, slightly less brief this time. "And you," she said, "have a past that is not simple and a reputation that is complicated, and a set of things you need to make right that will take more than one grand gesture." "All of that is true," he said, without flinching from any of it. "Good," Bessie said, "because I will not pretend it is not, and I do not want a man who pretends either." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a while, with the lamp between them and the guitar from the street, and the whole uncertain future spread out somewhere ahead of them like country not yet mapped. And Bessie thought that she had not expected to arrive here, had not expected, when she stepped off that stage with her boots and her fury and her $42, to find this. But the territory had a habit of offering things you had not packed for. Everett Cole's letter arrived 9 days after they had left his office. The filings were complete. The territorial court had issued orders. A United States Marshal had been dispatched to Lincoln County. Clifton Hale had been served notice of the proceedings, and had, according to Cole's sources, gone immediately and spectacularly to pieces, dismissing his men, burning correspondence, attempting to flee toward the Texas border before being apprehended 30 miles outside Lincoln by the Marshal's party. The network of corruption had unraveled with a speed that surprised everyone who had not understood how comprehensively the documents in that iron safe had documented it. The county judge and the deputy sheriff named in the papers were both arrested within 2 weeks. Land records were being painstakingly reconstructed. The families dispossessed of their homesteads were being notified through channels the court had established. Thomas Rhodes's homestead claim was formally restored to his estate in December of 1882, with the notation that all water rights attached to the original filing were confirmed. The estate, such as it was, passed to Bessie Rhodes as sole heir, documented and legal and irrefutable. They rode back to Redemption Creek in the 3rd week of December. The air was sharp and cold, and the mountains were white, and the land that had seemed so hard and indifferent when Bessie first saw it from the stage window now looked like something else to her, like possibility, like hers. Consuela Vega met them at the gate of the homestead, an elderly woman wrapped in a heavy shawl who looked at Bessie with dark, knowing eyes, and then looked at Graham Mercer standing 1 pace behind her and said, in her forthright way, "You are going to stay." It was not entirely a question. "If you mean Redemption Creek," Graham said, "that remains to be seen. If you mean," he glanced at Bessie, "yes, I am going to stay." Consuela Vega nodded with the satisfaction of a woman who had long suspected this would be the shape of things. The homestead required work. Thomas Rhodes had kept it well for years, but 8 months of vacancy and a hard season had left their marks. The roof needed 2 new sections. The fence line on the south pasture was down in 4 places. The kitchen garden was overgrown, and the root cellar needed cleaning. The well was sound, and the spring that fed it had not diminished, and the land itself was good. Graham walked it with Bessie on the 2nd afternoon, both of them in heavy coats in the December cold, and he pointed out what was salvageable and what would need replacing, and what the potential was for a small cattle operation in 3 or 4 years if they established the foundation correctly. He used the word "we" without noticing. She noticed and did not correct it. Felix Drummond was delighted to see her back, and more delighted than he could quite conceal to see who had come back with her, because Felix was a man who rooted for other people's happiness, with an enthusiasm that his own life had not required him to work at. being himself a happily married man with 4 children and a satisfactory business. He threw a gathering at the Mercantile the week of Christmas, calling it a simple holiday social while clearly arranging it as something more in the nature of a celebration. And the whole of Redemption Creek's respectable population turned out, along with the less respectable population, because Felix's wife made excellent cake, and the distinction between respectable and otherwise tended to soften in December. Everett Cole came from Santa Fe. He stood with Bessie near the window and told her that the court proceedings against Hale and his associates were moving forward and that her testimony might be required in the spring term, which she confirmed she would provide. He told her also that the restoration of the 12 homestead claims was proceeding, that 3 of the families had already been formally notified, and that the story had reached the territorial newspapers and was being covered with considerable interest. "You should know," Cole said, "that you have made enemies. Men who worked for Hale are still out there, and some of them have reasons to be unhappy." "I know," Bessie said. "Are you provided for in terms of—" He glanced at Graham, who was across the room talking to Felix. "Yes," Bessie said simply. Cole nodded. He was a man who understood the value of directness. The winter passed. Bessie kept her position at the Mercantile through February, because the homestead's income was not yet established, and the practical reality of money did not pause for romance. Graham took work with a small cattle outfit 15 miles north, day work that kept him within riding distance, and came to the homestead on Saturdays and Sundays to work on the fences and the roof and the root cellar. There was a Sunday in January that Bessie thought of afterward as the day things became clear, in a way that had no ambiguity left in it. She had been making bread, something she did on Sundays when she had time, because her father had always made bread on Sundays and the rhythm of it comforted her, and Graham had come in from the fence work cold and dusted with snow, and she had handed him coffee without being asked, and he had stood by the stove and drank it and watched her work the dough. "You look like you belong here," he said. "I do belong here," she said. "This is my father's land." "Yes," he said, "and more than that." She looked up from the dough. He was watching her with those gray eyes that she had spent months learning to read, and what she read in them now was uncomplicated, for once direct and curt and warm in a way that the cold and the distance and the careful practicality of their arrangement had perhaps disguised but had never actually dimmed. "Graham," she said. "Bessie," he said. He had started using her first name sometime in Albuquerque, and she had started using his at approximately the same time, and neither of them had marked the moment, but it had happened. "We have been very careful," she said. "We have," he agreed. "I am tired of being careful," she said. He set his coffee cup down and crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and took her flour-dusted hands in his and said, "Will you marry me?" with the directness of a man who had decided that the careful approach had gone on long enough. "Yes," said Bessie Rhodes, with the matching directness of a woman who had known her own mind for long enough that she had no further interest in pretending otherwise. And then he was holding her with the warmth and certainty of a man who intended to mean it for the rest of his life. They were married in March of 1883, in the small church in Redemption Creek, where Bessie's father was buried in the churchyard just beyond the south wall. The minister was a young man from Ohio named Reverend Potts, who conducted the ceremony with enthusiastic sincerity. Felix Drummond stood with Graham, beaming. Consuela Vega sat in the first pew and wept with uncomplicated joy. Agatha from the boarding house in Albuquerque had made the journey up and sat 2 rows back looking satisfied, as though the outcome had been obvious all along, and she was pleased that everyone else had caught up. Bessie wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself through the winter evenings, and she carried 3 flowers from Consuela Vega's hothouse, because March was too early for anything to be blooming outdoors in New Mexico. And she walked to the front of that small church feeling something she had not felt in a very long time, not just purposeful, which she always was, but complete. Graham stood at the front of the church and watched her come down the aisle with an expression on his face that the people present would describe afterward in various ways: intense, overcome, grateful, and that Bessie, who was closest and could see it clearly, would describe privately as a man who could not quite believe his luck and was taking it very seriously. The vows they spoke were the traditional ones. When it came to the part about for better or for worse, Bessie felt Graham's hands tighten slightly on hers, and she pressed back, because they both knew what worse had looked like and they were still here, and that was not nothing. After the ceremony, Felix threw a dinner at the mercantile that was somehow better than any dinner a mercantile had a right to produce, involving 3 kinds of roasted meat, and enough pies to feed the entire town, and a fiddle player who appeared from somewhere around 9 o'clock and played until midnight. Bessie danced twice with Graham, who danced with the careful deliberateness of a man who had learned the steps but did not entirely trust himself to execute them under observation, and she found this so endearing that she laughed, and the laugh surprised her with its own lightness. Clifton Hale was convicted in the territorial court in April of 1883 and sentenced to 12 years at the territorial prison. The county judge who had aided him received 8 years. The deputy sheriff received 5. The land restoration proceedings were completed over the course of that spring and summer, with all 12 families receiving formal restoration of their claims, and in 3 cases, financial compensation from the sequestered assets of Hale's estate, which was sold at public auction. Bessie testified at the trial in April. She sat in the witness chair in the Lincoln County Courthouse, a different courthouse, because the previous one had been found to harbor too many tainted records, and proceedings had been moved to a clean venue in a different county seat, and she gave her testimony in the clear, precise, organized way she gave everything, and she did not look away from Clifton Hale once during the process. He was a large man who had been made somehow smaller by the course of events, less because of any physical change than because the authority that had inflated him was gone, and without it, he was simply a man of late middle age with a heavy face and eyes that could not quite meet the witness chair without blinking. Graham testified after her. He was calm and thorough and precise, and he did not flinch from the parts of his testimony that implicated his own earlier actions, which the court noted with interest. The district attorney had arranged, in exchange for Graham's full cooperation and testimony, an agreement that his past association with Hale's operation, at the level at which he had participated, would not result in prosecution. This arrangement was legally sound, and Graham had negotiated it through Everett Cole with the same direct honesty he brought to everything now. They rode home from Lincoln together after the verdict came in the late afternoon of an April day that was warm and blooming, the desert coming into color the way it did every spring, as though the hard winter had been only gathering energy for this. The sky was long and gold ahead of them, and the road was clear. "It is finished," Bessie said. "Yes," Graham said. "My father's name is clean." "Yes." She rode for a while in the gentle silence of someone who has carried a weight for a long time and is only beginning to understand what it feels like to set it down. Graham rode beside her and did not interrupt the silence because he understood its nature. "He would have liked you," she said finally. Graham was quiet for a moment. "I would like to have deserved that." "You are getting there," she said, and meant it. They built the homestead through the rest of that year with the combined practical intelligence of 2 people who understood that love was not a feeling that suspended the need for hard work, but rather a feeling that made hard work bearable and sometimes even joyful. Bessie kept the books and managed the accounts and drove a hard bargain with the cattle buyers, and knew, by the end of her first year on the land, more about running a homestead operation than she had expected to learn in 5. Graham knew cattle the way that only a man who had been around them since youth could know them, their patterns, their health indicators, their preferences, and their limits, and he worked the land with the tireless commitment of a man who had finally found something worth working toward. They argued, because they were both opinionated people with strong convictions about how things ought to be done, and their arguments were sometimes heated and always resolved, because they had established early on that neither of them was interested in winning for the sake of winning, only in getting to the right answer by whatever route was most direct. Their first winter as a married couple was hard. A drought had come in during the late summer and the grazing was poor, and they had to sell 2 of their 3 small breeding pairs to cover costs and start smaller the following spring. They sat together at the kitchen table that January, both of them looking at the ledger, and Bessie said, "We will be all right," and Graham said, "I know," and neither of them doubted it. In the spring of 1884, Bessie told Graham she was expecting their first child. He received this information with a stillness that was not shock, but something deeper. The kind of response that comes from news that rearranges a person's interior landscape so fundamentally that they need a moment to locate themselves in the new arrangement. Then he pulled her close and held her for a long time without speaking, and she could feel in the quality of his embrace something that had nothing to do with words and needed none. Their son was born in November of 1884, a solid, serious baby with Graham's gray eyes and Bessie's determined set to his small jaw. They named him Thomas Graham Mercer, for her father first and Graham second, because Thomas Rhodes deserved that continuity and because Graham had not objected, but had looked at the suggestion with the particular expression of a man who understood exactly why it mattered. Thomas was a good baby in the sense of being robust and healthy, though not particularly easy in the sense of being placid. He had opinions from very early on and expressed them at volume, which Felix Drummond, who came to see him at 3 weeks old, declared to be entirely predictable given his parentage, a joke that both parents chose to receive as a compliment. Consuela Vega, who had no grandchildren of her own and had adopted the Mercer family as the closest available substitute, came every Thursday and held Thomas with the practiced ease of a woman who had raised 6 children of her own, and told Bessie things about infant care that no book had included, and that Bessie wrote down in a small journal with the same systematic thoroughness she brought to the ranch accounts. The homestead grew. By 1885, they had rebuilt the south pasture fence entirely with cedar posts that would last 20 years, established a reliable herd of 23 cattle, put in an orchard of 8 apple trees that would not bear fruit for 3 more years but would be productive for decades, and built a second room onto the house for Thomas and whatever siblings might follow. Graham had found, in the rhythms of the homestead, something he had been looking for a long time, without knowing exactly what shape it would take: a sense of being squarely in his own life, of belonging to a place and a person and a purpose that were all genuinely his own. He was not a man given to speaking about his interior state in great detail, but Bessie read him now with the confidence of familiarity, and she could see the difference in him. The way the old tired quality had lifted from his face and been replaced by something steadier and more grounded. He still had bad nights sometimes, the kind that came in the small hours and were rooted in specific memories he had not been able to entirely displace. She knew this because she was a light sleeper and she always woke. She would put her hand on his arm in the dark and he would put his hand over hers and neither of them would say anything, and eventually he would sleep again, and in the morning they would get up and make coffee and begin the day. This was, Bessie thought, what marriage actually was: not the grand moments, though those existed too, but this: the hand in the dark, the morning coffee, the ordinary continuity of choosing each other in every small repeated moment. In 1886, Graham was approached by the county commissioners to stand for the position of county land recorder, the official responsible for maintaining homestead and property records, the very position whose corruption had allowed Hale's operation to exist. The irony of this was not lost on anyone involved, and it was in fact the reason the commissioners wanted him. His testimony in the Hale trial had established him as a man of documented honesty about his own history, and honesty about one's own history was the credential that mattered most for a position whose entire purpose was to maintain accurate records. He came home and told Bessie about it that evening. She looked at him steadily for a moment. "Do you want it?" "I want to know what you think," he said. "I think," she said, "that it is the most appropriate possible form of making amends that I could have invented, and I did not invent it." She paused. "I think my father would appreciate the symbolism enormously." Graham looked at her. "Is that a yes?" "It is a yes," she said. He ran for the position in the fall election of 1886 and won with a solid majority, which surprised him somewhat and did not surprise Bessie at all, because she understood that the people of Lincoln County had been looking for someone to trust with their records and their land and their futures, and that Graham Mercer, reformed outlaw turned scrupulously honest public servant, was a more compelling figure than he fully appreciated. He took to the work with the same careful thoroughness he brought to everything, and over the 3 years of his first term, he rebuilt the county's record system from near scratch, implementing a filing system borrowed partly from Bessie's accounting practice and partly from systems he researched in correspondence with land offices in other territories. He was meticulous about accuracy and ruthless about documentation, and the county's homesteaders began to sleep better knowing their records were being kept by a man who understood, from both sides, exactly what the stakes were. Bessie ran the ranch during the days he was at the county offices. She was better at it than either of them had originally anticipated, which had less to do with natural aptitude, though she had that, than with the fact that she had approached every aspect of the operation as a learnable skill, and had learned it systematically, consulting everyone who would talk to her, reading every agricultural almanac and cattleman's circular she could find, and applying the same systematic intelligence to the land that she had once applied to legal documents. Their second child was born in 1887, a daughter they named Clara Consuela Mercer, the second name for Consuela Vega, who received this honor with a composure that lasted approximately 40 seconds before she wept comprehensively and had to be provided with a handkerchief from Graham's pocket. Clara was the opposite of Thomas in temperament, quick, sunny, and sociable in a way that sometimes made Bessie wonder how two people as self-contained as she and Graham had produced someone so instinctively outward-facing. Thomas, at 3, was already showing the particular combination of stubbornness and practicality that made Bessie look at him sometimes and feel a pang of recognition, so acute it was almost painful. The letter came in the autumn of 1887, addressed to Bessie, from a law office in Kansas City. It concerned her mother's family, specifically a small property interest that a great-uncle she had never met had held in Kansas, and that, upon his death without heirs, had passed through several hands by legal succession and arrived at Bessie as the sole surviving member of the relevant family line. The property itself was not large, a fraction of a quarter section of farmland in a county she had never visited, but the sale of it provided enough capital to substantially expand the homestead's cattle operation, which they did carefully over the following 2 years, doubling the herd by 1889 and establishing a reliable contract with a beef supplier in Albuquerque. Felix Drummond retired the mercantile in 1888 and sold it to a young couple from Texas, which he did with his characteristic good humor, and which necessitated a long farewell dinner at his house, where Bessie made a speech that made Felix cry and made Graham, who did not cry, look very carefully at the ceiling for a period of approximately 30 seconds. Everett Cole visited twice, once in 1887 and once in 1889, and both times stayed for a week and conducted himself as the friend he had become rather than the lawyer he had originally been. He was on his second visit that he sat on the porch with Graham in the evening while Bessie put Thomas and Clara to bed and said, in his direct way, that in 20 years of legal practice he had seen perhaps 3 situations that had begun as badly as this one and resolved as well. "You did that," he told Graham. Bessie did that, Graham said. Both of you did it, Cole said. Do not minimize your part in it. The courage to bring those papers to her, to testify, to stand in that courtroom and be honest about everything you had been that mattered. The outcome depended on it. Graham was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land in the evening light. The apple trees in the orchard were in their 4th year and had borne their first small crop that fall, not much, barely enough for a barrel of cider and some preserves, but real fruit from trees they had planted which felt significant. I was trying to figure out how to live with myself, Graham said finally. It was not heroism. Most of the best things people do, Cole said, are trying to figure out how to live with themselves. That does not make them less. Bessie came back to the porch and found them in companionable silence and sat down with her tea, and the three of them watched the stars come out over New Mexico and said little, because little needed to be said. Thomas Mercer, at 8 years old, had developed an alarming interest in the legal and record-keeping aspects of his father's work, which Graham encouraged with the quiet pride of a man who had not previously imagined that this was the sort of thing he might have to offer a child. He brought Thomas to the county offices on Saturdays and let him help with the filing system, and Thomas took this work with a seriousness that was almost comical in its exactness. Clara, at 6, had decided she was going to be a school teacher, which she announced at dinner one evening in the flat, declarative way of a child who has settled a question completely. Bessie, who had never had the opportunity for formal education beyond the basics and had always been aware of the lack, resolved then and there that Clara would have every opportunity available, which meant finding a way to improve the educational resources of Redemption Creek generally, because she was constitutionally unable to solve a problem for one person when she could see how to solve it for everyone. She organized the push for a proper school building in 1889 and 1890, which involved negotiating with the town council, raising funds through a subscription campaign, and drafting the terms of employment for a qualified teacher in language that took a month to get right. The school opened in September of 1890 with 23 students from the town and outlying homesteads, a teacher recruited from Denver named Miss Hartwell, and a dedication ceremony at which Bessie Rhodes Mercer, who had organized the whole thing, said a few words that were practical and direct and not particularly long, which the assembled crowd appreciated. Graham sat in the front row at the ceremony with Thomas on one side of him and Clara on the other, and he watched his wife stand at the front of that new building and speak with her characteristic confidence and precision, and he thought about a stage stop 4 years earlier, a woman who had almost fallen through a rotted board and had told him she could manage. He thought about the long night in the mercantile. He thought about the lined shack and the cold dark of the night watch, and the way she had looked when she opened the safe and found her father's papers. He thought about being handed a story that might have ended in 10 different bad ways and watching it instead arrive here. This building, this town, these children, this woman who was more entirely herself than anyone he had ever known and who had somehow, without diminishing any of that, also become his. He thought that he had arrived in Redemption Creek 3 years earlier as a man who had been trying to survive his own history, and that he was leaving that version of himself behind not through any single dramatic act of redemption, but through the accumulated weight of 10,000 ordinary choices made in the right direction. It was enough. It was more than enough. The 1890s brought more change to New Mexico territory, as they brought change to the whole of the American West railroads extending their reach into formerly remote areas, more settlers arriving, the territory growing toward statehood with the grinding, contested pace of political processes. Redemption Creek grew too, from 500 to nearly 1,200 people by 1895, and the creek that had always run dry in August was finally diverted into a proper irrigation channel, which Bessie had advocated for through 3 separate council meetings with the dogged patience she brought to all civic matters. Graham was re-elected county land recorder twice and served a total of 9 years in the position before stepping back in 1895 to focus fully on the ranch, which by then was a substantial operation that required both of them to manage well. The record system he had built continued after him, maintained by a deputy he had trained personally in his methods. They had a third child in 1892, a son they named James, who came into the world with less drama than his siblings and proceeded to grow with a quiet steadiness that both parents found restful. James was interested in horses in the specific, technical way of a natural horseman, and by the time he was 5, he could sit a horse with the kind of unconscious balance that took most riders years to develop. The homestead by 1895 was a different place than it had been when Bessie inherited it, not unrecognizably different, because they had been careful to preserve what her father had built and to build upon it rather than over it, but expanded and improved and productive in ways that Thomas Rhodes might have imagined for it in his most optimistic moments. The orchard was bearing well now, 8 mature trees producing enough that they had begun selling the surplus in town. The cattle operation supported the family comfortably. The house had 3 proper rooms added onto the original structure, and the kitchen Bessie had worked in from the beginning now had a stove that had not rusted itself to unreliability. She still made bread on Sundays. Graham still came in from whatever outdoor work he had been doing and accepted a cup of coffee and stood by the stove and watched her work the dough, and the familiarity of this had not, across 12 years, made it ordinary in the way that some familiar things went flat. It had instead deepened into something that felt, to both of them, like the precise shape of what they had meant when they made their vows. On a Sunday afternoon in the spring of 1895, Bessie was at the kitchen table going through accounts when Graham came in from checking the south fence and sat down across from her. The house was quiet. Thomas was at the county library that had opened the previous year. Clara was at the school, where she had been helping Miss Hartwell as an assistant for the past year and considering applying to the teachers' college in Albuquerque. And James was in the corral with the young gelding he was trying to settle. The light was soft and long through the kitchen window, and the apple blossoms were visible through the glass, white and brief in the spring air. Graham put a small object on the table between them. It was her father's leather cord, the frayed, knotted sailor's knot that had bound the homestead papers. She had kept it in a box with her father's few other personal effects, and she had not realized that Graham knew where it was. She looked at it and then at him. "I found it when I was looking for the box of James's documents," he said. "His birth registration." "I know," she said. She had put it back in the box herself. He looked at the cord. "I think about that night," he said. "When I gave you those papers, I think about it more than I say." She regarded him. "What do you think about it?" "That I almost did not come," he said. "That I stood outside the hotel where you were staying for 20 minutes trying to decide if I had the right to walk through that door after everything I had been part of." He paused. "That I almost chose to disappear instead. Montana, Wyoming, somewhere without a record." "But you came," she said. "You had a right to know," he said. "Your father had a right to have his name given back. That was larger than what I was afraid of." "Yes," she said. "It was." He looked at her steadily. "I need you to know that I have never stopped being grateful that you opened the door, that you listened, that you—" He stopped. "That I married you," she offered. "That you saw something worth," he tried again. And then, because he was a man who had always been more comfortable with action than articulation, he simply reached across the table and took her hand, which said what he meant better than the words had been managing anyway. She held his hand and looked at him across the table in the spring afternoon light. This weathered, gray-eyed man who had come into her life carrying her father's stolen papers and a dark past and a genuine wish to do better, and who had spent 12 years proving, one ordinary morning at a time, that the wish was real. She thought about her father, who was buried in the churchyard behind the small church where she had been married, beneath a marker that now read Thomas Rhodes, homesteader, 1834–1882. Father and honest man, words she had chosen herself. She thought about the papers that had come back to her hands, and the land that had come back to her name, and the life that had grown up in the space between grief and purpose, and the particular grace of being found by the right person at the worst possible moment. "Graham," she said. "Yes," he said, which was still his best answer to the sound of his name from her. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her with the gray eyes that she had spent 12 years learning and that she would spend however many years remained learning still. "For what?" he asked. "For coming through the door," she said. He squeezed her hand, and outside the apple blossoms moved in the spring wind, white against the vast New Mexico blue, and the creek ran clear over its stones. And somewhere in the corral young James Mercer was working his gelding in easy circles. And the story that had begun with a stolen inheritance and a dark road, and a man who had carried his guilt long enough to finally know what to do with it, was not a story anymore, but a life steady and real and continuing, rooted in honest earth, held together by the kind of love that does not announce itself but simply persists, morning after morning, season after season, year after year, as certain and necessary as water. The apple trees would bear well that autumn, and the ones that came after it. Thomas would go to law school in Santa Fe in 1901, returning to Redemption Creek to practice the kind of law that kept records honest and land in the hands of people who had earned it. Clara would become a teacher, as she had announced at 6 years old, first at the Redemption Creek School, and then as its principal when Miss Hartwell retired, and she would bring the same wide-open warmth to the work that had always characterized her. James would breed horses on the expanded homestead, developing a reputation across the territory for producing animals of reliable temperament and unusual soundness, and his horses would be working ranches across New Mexico into the next generation. And Bessie Rhodes Mercer would sit at her kitchen table and make her accounts and make her bread on Sundays and grow old in the land her father had earned. And Graham Mercer would stand by the stove with his coffee and watch her with the particular expression of a man who understood exactly what he had been given and had never for a single day taken it for granted. The cord from her father's papers stayed in the box with his effects, knotted in the sailor's knot that Thomas Rhodes had learned from a fisherman in Galveston, keeping its shape across all the years that followed, small and weathered and lasting. Some things, once tied properly, hold.